So we already discussed the cell structure, the classification of protozoa. It's time to talk about some interesting pathogens. We're going to start with amoebae. First group of microorganisms among the amoebae are the genus Entamoeba and Balamuthia. These are, and I can't emphasize it enough, free-living organisms that reside in the soil for the most part. They can penetrate through the skin, damaged skin, like scratches. May also infect conjunctiva. And the disease that they cause is called granulomatous amoebic meningoencephalitis. These are the cross-sections of the brain of a patient who died of it. You may remember Naegleria fowleri, the brain-eating amoeba that we talked about in the beginning of the course. So it causes primary amoebic meningoencephalitis, and the infection with Naegleria is really rapid. The infection with these guys is relatively slow, which means it is treatable and it is curable. Now, these infections are pretty rare, even in the countries where people have way more contact with the soil compared to us. Like, crawling around and stuff. However, Entamoeba histolytica is the classic parasite, classic disease-causing amoeba. So it is mostly transmitted through the contaminated water and the food that was washed in the contaminated water. Water quality is one of the biggest problems in the world. So when it gets in the human colon, it causes ulcerative colitis, which results in dysentery, obviously cramps, abdominal pain, hemorrhage, so on and so forth. Okay? Perforations. Okay? So it kills up to 100,000 people a year all over the world. And another interesting thing about Entamoeba is that since it causes bloody stool, it means that the barrier between the gut content and the blood has been broken, which means amoeba can end up in the circulation, and they can infect liver and lungs, resulting in amoebomas, which is like a granuloma, but with amoeba inside. They're not good, but they can be detected, they can be surgically removed, and that's the end of the story. It's good, that's it. Okay? It's treatable, and preventing is sanitation. Now, if you're concerned about any protozoan disease that is transmitted via oral route, boil your water, and if you are in the region with a questionable water quality, everything that you eat should be fried, and the water that you should drink should be only bottled water. Okay? I always bring this example that the kids went on a mission trip to El Salvador, and it was not very rural, but fairly rural, and they called us in the middle of a trip, reporting that everything's awesome, but they had diarrhea for the last couple of days, and my first question was, did you eat anything green? They did. And no, it's not time to start a healthy diet, okay? Now get into the heavy hitter, malaria. This is the third most important infectious disease in terms of the human death in the world. Would you guess first two? HIV, yes, that's number one. What's number two? TB, tuberculosis. HIV, tuberculosis, then malaria. Okay? So apicomplexa, not moving, obligate parasite. Human disease is caused by 4 different species of the genus Plasmodium. You do not need to know. Richard is probably going to be bored because he knows all of that already. So Plasmodium causes malaria. You don't need to know which 4 species. Transmitted by mosquitoes. By the way, we do have Anopheles mosquitoes that transmit malaria in the United States. And this year, there were several cases of the transmission of malaria inside the US. Usually it's important. You see what I'm saying? But some people who got infected got bitten by a mosquito, and that mosquito transmitted it to another person within the United States. I believe it was in Texas. So annually, 500,000 people die. Well, ballpark. It's a little less, but you know. And I use it as an illustration of the hypocrisy of the developed world. So 500,000 people died way before COVID every year. And it's okay. As long as it doesn't touch us, we're good with that. Okay? By the way, 70% of those deaths are children aged from 6 months to 5 years, and we'll explain why that is. So, you get bitten, there's an incubation period, malaise, fatigue, back aches, nausea, and then you develop classic symptoms of malaria, which are bouts of chills, fever, and sweating. I'm looking at, people who actually witnessed that. Am I describing it correctly? Yeah. So I've heard that it's really bad. I don't have any, It is bad. So, now what's interesting, the timing of those bouts depends on the species. Okay? By type, I mean the species. So a trained physician can say, oh, you have these bouts every 3 days, it's falciparum. Every 4 days, it's, malaria, whatever, ovale. I'm not really a trained physician. And we can explain why that is. Malaria is treatable and I want to say curable. What does that mean? Why I'm being a bit circumspect. Once you get infected, you consider to be malaria positive for the rest of your life. If you donate blood and you try to donate blood and you answer the question, have you ever had malaria? Yes. You deferred for life. Because nobody can guarantee that you don't have a couple of plasmodia hanging around somewhere in the corner of your liver. Now, treatment works marvelously well. Those are all derivatives of quinine, mefloquine, chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, infamous one. There's also a treatment drug called artemisinin. They're all good. Okay? There's some side effects, obviously. But what I've heard about all the chloroquines, quinines, they have what is described, and I don't know, I never got one. They induce vivid dreams. I spoke with a guy who was in Marines, who had to take it prophylactically during the deployment. I think he was in Somalia. And at some point he said, screw that, I'm not taking this shit. He was so upset about the side effects. He got like it. So how do you prevent malaria? Vector control. Repellents, bed nets. And why is there no malaria in the United States? In the southern states, let's talk about like Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama. They do have mosquitoes. Huh? Air conditioner, yes. It's all about air conditioning. If you prevent mosquitoes from coming in, they're not going to bite you. Okay? And the activity, also, you know, if you spend a lot of time, there was a study estimating how many mosquito bites an average child in like rural African village gets a day. Huh? 200. 200 bites. It's a lot. It's a lot of bites. So there's a pretty good chance there's going to be transmission. So some experts suggest the use of DDT, but not the way we... Are you familiar with DDT? Up until 1970s, DDT was used to kill mosquitoes and was extremely efficient. It was also extremely efficient in causing human cancers. So it was, the usage was stopped. Mosquitoes rebounded and all mosquito-borne infections went bananas. Now the idea is to spray DDT on the window sills, because turns out window frames, turns out mosquitoes, when they fly in, they land on the window frame first. And they would land and get killed, and it's all good. So, okay, I know that this looks absolutely intimidating. I'm going to guide you through this to make a conceptual sense out of a life cycle. You don't need to know the names for different forms of malaria. So we start with a mosquito bite that introduces the parasites into the bloodstream. In about 15 minutes, the parasites, Plasmodium, infect liver and stay there until you start treatment. So liver becomes inflamed and enlarged, and that's hepatomegaly. Liver releases a different form of parasites, you don't need to know the exact name, which have a particular taste, exclusive taste, for red blood cells, and they infect red blood cells. In red blood cells, they feed on the globin part of hemoglobin. They toss away heme. They develop into adults, and then they rupture out of the red blood cell. When red blood cell is ruptured, does anyone remember what the name of for this process is? Hemolysis. Which isn't good. When a lot of red blood cells rupture, you develop chills, fever, shakes, and the timing depends on the species. Does that make sense to you? Now, red blood cells that are infected can be recognized by your spleen and removed from the blood, but spleen has to work over time. So second symptom of malaria is splenomegaly, in addition to hepatomegaly, but that's not it. So in addition to like regular parasites, the red blood cell stage also generates gametes that are basically male and female cells, just like humans do, like meiosis, right? So these gametes or gametocytes get into another mosquito, encounter each other in that mosquito, form a zygote, which is again diploid. In mosquito, the zygote develops into a bunch of adults that are injected into human bloodstream, and the cycle starts over. Does that make sense? So I'm going to introduce the concept of the definitive host and intermediate host. So the definitive host, in this case it's mosquito, is the one in which the adult version of a parasite is produced. You see, the gametes form a zygote, and zygote develops into an adult in the mosquito. Mosquito is a definitive host, and humans in this case are what's called an intermediate host. Okay, so far, are we all right? So, few things on things that I wanted to comment on. First, the vaccine. First of all, there is an experimental vaccine against malaria that reduces the disease and the mortality by 70%. It is in the trials now. The only question is who's going to produce it, because mass vaccination program costs a lot of money, and some countries simply can't afford it. Second comment about vaccine. You can't really control the infection because you have 15 minutes to stop Plasmodium to get in the liver. Not a lot of time. So I believe that vaccine, rather than controlling the infection, controls the disease and basically reduces the severity. Okay? Another thing that I wanted to comment on is why 70% of deaths are in kids. So 6 months to 5 years of age. Why not from the birth? Why not a lot of kids die during the first 6 months? Huh? Overall, yeah. The vertical, the passive immunity from a mother. Breastfeeding and natural antibodies that are passed through the placenta. At 6 months, they start to constrict. That response starts to constrict and they become sensitive. Now, most deaths occur due to what's called the cerebral malaria. To my shame, I don't remember the exact mechanism. All I remember is that Plasmodium somehow reduces the blood flow to the brain because of the small size of the blood vessels in kids. And basically they develop hypoxia, coma, and die. By the age of 5 years, it just doesn't happen that often because they're bigger. And then if you survive 5 years, you're probably going to survive throughout. Does that make sense? So it's pretty bad. This is another one of my favorite pathogens. It is toxoplasma. Many consider toxoplasma being the most successful pathogen in the face of the earth, because allegedly it infects from half to 2/3 of the world population, which is maybe a bit of a stretch, but so instead of, I'm going to again make it fairly simple. So let's start with the quote-unquote benign path. So you have the cysts in the fecal matter that get consumed by pigs or cows, and then we butcher, cook, and eat those tasty animals. Okay, that makes sense? Now, when you cook pork, you cook it throughout. But in my opinion, well-done steak is an abomination. You might as well just chew on it on a shoe, okay? It has to be medium rare, which means cysts can survive, can be consumed by humans, and can infect them. And if you are an immunocompetent adult, nothing happens to you. Did I just ruin the steaks? I hope so. I really hope so. So to give an idea, almost a quarter of the population in the US are infected with toxoplasma. And some of you may be infected. I'm pretty certain I'm infected, just because my food habits. As long as I'm immunocompetent, I'm fine. Like seriously, no disease whatsoever. Okay? Immunocompromised folks, though, can develop life-threatening encephalitis, especially patients with AIDS. That's a big problem for them, and die. In France, and I can tell you in Brazil, the percentage of the population that are positive for toxoplasma reaches 75 to 80%. Where do they get it from? Meat. There's a dish, French dish, called steak tartare, which is effectively raw meat. Oh, come on. Say again? Can't hear. Yeah, that's the goal. That's the goal. So, do you have cats? I'm not. You had? Okay. So, cats, especially if you let them out and they hunt rodents, can eat an infected mouse. That's what cats do. That's fine. That's fine. Yeah. So, interestingly enough, mice that are infected with toxoplasma stop avoiding cats. And it's been shown that, so how does the Jerry knows where Tom is? Jerry is very good at smelling Tom's urine. Turns out, when mice are infected with toxoplasma, they stop avoiding cat's urine. Nobody knows if they just don't give a crap or they lose the sense of smell, but that's the truth. And they become very easy prey. Cat eats the mouse, gets infected, and passes cysts in the feces. And the whole purpose of every human being who owns a cat is to be a servant of that animal. You know, removing the litter and stuff. This is why pregnant women are advised to stay away from cat's litter and undercooked beef. Toxoplasma can be transmitted vertically and seriously. And we're not talking about, like, there is a chance. It's not a chance. Fetal infection will result in teratogenic consequences. Fetus is going to be badly affected. Okay? So, to be fair, if you have a house cat that does not even leave the house, you're fine. Okay? Oh. Say again? Well, you're positive. That's all. That's a different story, because eye infection, that's actually a pretty rare condition. Because, is it in the retina? Or, yep. Okay, so we'll talk after the class. You can't imagine how excited I am inside. Like, you cannot remotely imagine. Like, for me, does anyone listen to Taylor Swift? Give me some name. What's your favorite artist? Cardi B. Imagine this is Cardi B. I'm dead serious. I'm not making fun. I will explain later, okay? I am dead serious. So the back of your eye, the vitreous chamber, the posterior segment, is immunoprivileged site. It means that immune system doesn't have an access there. Clear? Toxoplasma is a neurotropic infection. If it finds a way to get through the optic nerve into the back of an eye, there's no immune system to detect it. Okay? I just don't want to interrupt it, but it's insane. And last protozoa that I want to mention, leishmania. I don't know if anyone heard or encountered. So geographically, to give an idea, gray countries don't have data. Okay, so South America, really bad. North Africa, probably Central Africa as well. Now this cracks me up. Okay, so This is Pakistan. Why? This is India. India shows like no data. Leishmania is in India, like it's there. We'll know that it happens. Okay, they just don't have enough surveillance data. So it is, it's transmitted by sandflies, which are like Dollar General version of a normal mosquito. They can't really fly well. No, seriously, they can't basically fly above the level of the human waist. Okay, this is why in people who just walk normally, leishmaniasis manifests on the legs. Okay, so there are 3 types of leishmaniasis. We'll get back to that leg manifestation. There's a cutaneous form, also known as a scleral ulcer. I don't know if that's not a great, really high quality image, but it's right here. It's an ulcer. It's painless, doesn't scratch. Eventually it heals. That's it. The more severe form, known as Espundia, is mucocutaneous. You can see the ulcer is on the tongue of that woman. This is the most benign image that I could find. There's a famous image of a person who doesn't have lips and the soft palate and the tongue, because it will infect mucous membranes and just chew through. Okay? And then there's a visceral form, also known as Kala Azar. It means something like black fever or something in one of the languages of India, I believe. Visceral leishmaniasis is very severe, and if untreated leads to death, like you die. Okay? Now, first of all, what is a scleral ulcer? Scleros is the jargon name for agricultural workers in some South American countries. When they work in the field, do they stand upright or do they lean forward? They lean forward and they get bitten by sandflies not only in the legs. Am I making sense? Now, if you have an ulcer like this on your leg, I'm not saying it's okay, but people don't really see it all the time. But imagine that you have this ulcer in the face. It's pretty disfiguring. So in some villages, the primitive form of vaccination is done. When a child reaches, I don't remember what age, usually it's like 1, parents would find a person with the cutaneous form of leishmaniasis, scrape some material from the ulcer, and scarify, basically scratch the kid's skin on the butt, and rub that ulcer material into the skin to cause the disease. It's going to be a small local ulcer on the butt. So it will be there, child grows. If somebody sees a person's butt, it's usually a pretty intimate event, right? So it's much better to have an ulcer in the butt than to have an ulcer in the face. It's a vaccination of sorts. Okay? Just like malaria, leishmania infection results in a lifetime deferral from blood donation. It affected the U.S. troops when, during the Iraq War, the first Iraq War in 1991, a lot of troops got infected. They were all cured, but they become ineligible for blood donation, which is a big bummer for the army. Okay, my second favorite, Helminths. So we have worms, 3 phyla. We have nematodes, They are round, meaning that they're cylindrical. They're most complicated. They have body cavity, and they have sexes. This is important because it means that for these worms to reproduce, a male must encounter a female in order to make eggs. Does that make sense? Trematodes, these guys, also known as flukes. They flat but not segmented, don't have body cavity, and they are hermaphrodites. And the most primitive ones, cestodes, which are tapeworms, they flat and segmented, don't have body cavity, just like flukes, and are hermaphrodites as well. So how do you treat them? Here's the problem. Bacteria, for instance, they constantly reproduce. So if you target the reproductive strategy of bacteria, you can kill them. Worms, on the other hand, if you have a worm, even if you prevent the worm from making new eggs, you still have a worm, so you have to kill an adult. Okay? How do you do that? You either prevent it from repairing itself or paralyze it. So drugs, I call them bendazoles. There's a bunch of them: mebendazole, thiabendazole, albendazole. All of them prevent the synthesis of microtubules, the structures that you may remember are critical for the cell division. Cells don't divide, eventually the worm dies for good. And then there's a famous ivermectin drug, which people who developed it got Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 2015. And the mechanism is amazing. So this drug binds to chloride channels that are normally gated by glutamate. And when it binds here, it opens them. Chloride is a negatively charged ion. It diffuses into the cell, hyperpolarizes it, and if the cell is a muscle cell, it's inhibited. If it's a nervous cell, it's inhibited. Worms become paralyzed. Those of you who have dogs, do you give them heartworm medication? You should. Cats, heartworm medication? Well, we'll talk about it later, but so basically, here's an idea. You give this medication, and if there are any worms that recently got into a dog, they get paralyzed. That's it. And eventually, they die, get out, whatever, right? That makes sense?
So you give it to them, you paralyze them?
No, the worms get paralyzed. Okay? Does that make sense? So those are only two drugs, which mechanism you should know. And let's dive straight into some really exciting. I just picked some examples. So first we're going to start with the cestode, Echinococcus granulosus. So this is a very interesting worm. Its life cycle, and I focus heavily on life cycles here. Its life cycle includes dogs as the definitive host and sheep as the intermediate host. So an adult worm is in dogs, and it produces a lot of eggs that get passed in dog feces. Now imagine we're talking about some mom and pop farm. Dogs are running around, right? And the species are all over, and sheep roam around. And eventually, sheep will consume the eggs and develop what's called a hydatid cyst in the liver. Now, obviously, sheep don't speak, so they can't complain that there's something wrong with the liver. And eventually, sheep are going to get butchered, right? And the meat will be either eaten or sold. And what would you do if you're not Russian? What would you do with the liver? Probably throw it away, But not just for the waste. You're going to feed it to the dogs, which means dogs will eat the larvae that are inside of that, cyst, and become reinfected. Make sense? So, when I said Russians love liver, any kind of liver. So how do you stop it? The transmission. You stop feeding dogs with sheep liver and dewormed animals. Okay? Now, where do humans come in the equation? Humans are accidental hosts. If humans on that farm accidentally ingest the eggs, as one student wrote in an answer to a say question during the online class, when a person eats dog poop, which is a very interesting practice, and I don't think it's that common, they will play a role of sheep. The eggs will end up in human liver, where they will develop in larvae and result in hydatid cyst. Am I clear? Yes? Hepatomegaly, tenderness in the right hypochondriac region. The biggest damage, the biggest issue though, the fluid that fills those cysts is extremely allergenic. If the cyst ruptures, it usually results in anaphylactic shock and death. Because, you don't know that you carry it, you don't have EpiPen with you. Okay, so cysts can be removed, and that's the end of the story for the person. Now let's talk about some flukes. So first is schistosoma. There are multiple species of it. The life cycle, since it's a cycle, it's really silly to say it starts, but nevertheless, it starts with eggs that are passed by humans in the urine or in the feces. These eggs end up in the water, where they infect the snail. Not directly, but for our intents and purposes, snails are intermediate hosts. Eventually, snails release larval form called cercariae. Don't need to know that term, just larva. And then you go and swim in that water. So, cercariae, these green guys, end up on your skin. So, say you get out of the water and you realize you don't have a towel, but it's hot enough for you to dry. In that fateful moment, cercariae penetrate through the skin. They don't need any breakage. They basically get through the hair follicle, end up in the circulation, and then, depending on the species, localize themselves in the blood vessels that surround either intestines or, for some reason I don't see it here, I didn't write it down, or urinary bladder. Am I making sense? So they are in the capillaries, either around intestines or urinary bladder. Around intestines, fever, diarrhea, fatigue, all that kind of stuff. It can cause CNS problems in a chronic condition. It can cause hypertension because they block blood flow. And in people who are infected with, I think it's mostly hematobium, schistosoma hematobium, they will develop cystitis and hematuria, which is the blood in the urine. First of all, it is treatable. Second, it's preventable. If you decide to swim in schistosoma-infested lake, have a towel. When you get out, dry yourself. If there was you can also tell if something happens to you, because first sign of infection is rash and fever. It's called Katayama fever. And the rash will be localized where water touched your skin. There was a case of a missionary worker that worked in Africa and during the mass baptism and was staying waist deep in the lake and then like in the pants and then got out and just dried. When he came to the doctor, he had rash below the waist, all the way through, because that's where the water was. Nothing above that line. Okay? And you can see that it affects mostly African countries. Okay? A little bit of South America. A little historical fact. When historians read ancient Egyptian manuscripts, they actually had like not necessarily religious, just like records. And they came across a concept that effectively meant male menstruation. And they're like, what the hell, right? So it turns out in ancient Egypt, pretty much all boys started to have blood in the urine about the age of 12, 14, which very well coincides with the prevalence of schistosoma in the river Nile. So they thought it was probably schistosomiasis. And urinary schistosomiasis, if untreated, results in chronic bladder inflammation and bladder cancer. Okay. Another fluke, which is really exciting and is present in the United States, is the sheep fluke. The life cycle is fairly similar. Actually, the size, we have some fasciola in the lab. You will take a look at them later today. We're not going to have a lot of lab activities, but some. So fasciola also uses snails as the intermediate host. So far, making sense? Yeah? And sorry, I have a brain fart. Yeah. And then releases cercariae in the water. This time, water is used for irrigation. And these larvae end up on the plants. These plants can be consumed by ruminants, cows and sheep, or humans. And in humans, this larvae, bless you, when they end up in the intestine, they take a hike and crawl into bile ducts. And then depending on which bile duct they decide to go into, they may end up in the liver or in the gallbladder. They damage both, which explains well the symptoms. So hepatomegaly, hives, nausea, diarrhea, malabsorption of fats, that kind of stuff. But the most exciting thing here is the gallbladder cancer. Well, I'm not saying that it's an exciting thing. It's a mechanism. Fasciola hepatica is a farming worm. It feeds on the epithelial cells of the bile ducts and gallbladder. In order to make more food, this worm releases a chemical that stimulates those cells to divide. When cells constantly divide, that leads to cancer. Does that make sense? Again, treatable. Prevention, deworming of cow and sheep, deworming of people. This little country right here is Iceland. It has no Fasciola hepatica whatsoever. Now, that sounds more like a Viking legend, so it better be true. In Iceland, they had a problem with fasciola, and they solved it in the most Viking way. They dewormed the entire population, simultaneously butchering all sheep on the island, 300,000 of them, and disposing of the corpses. And then they brought fresh sheep that didn't have. That's it. It's an island. It doesn't survive outside of the host. This is, in my opinion, almost the culmination in terms of like how cool it is. You're gonna dissect an Ascarias lumbricoides today. Don't worry, they are in formalin, so it's all safe. So it can be pretty long, to 1 foot. This is a roundworm. Tapeworms can get way longer than that. So it's 1 foot long, and it has the big ones have a thickness of a number 2 pencil. It all starts sorry, when people accidentally consume embryonated eggs. The life cycle is amazing. So they consume eggs, which end up, as you can imagine, within the intestine, where they hatch into larvae, right? And larvae penetrate intestinal walls, end up in the circulation, and swim towards the lungs. There they penetrate into the lungs and start moving around, trying to get to your larynx. That irritates your bronchi, so you start coughing, helping the worms to get to the voice box, and where you swallow them again. When they pass the intestines the second time, they become adult worms. Okay? You can see that in this case, females are significantly larger than males, but males have this little hook at the end. Okay? They do not attach themselves to the walls of your small intestine. They swim in there, like little Michael Phelpses. Now, the problems so if you have only one worm, it's not going to produce eggs, because you need 2, because there's a male and a female. But there's a pretty good chance that you're going to swallow another egg. And then if you have a male and a female, they start having babies, eggs. A female can produce from 100,000 to 1 million eggs a day. They all are passed in human feces. And you may wonder, how do they get in the food? Human feces in very poor rural areas. What are they used for? Night soil. A fertilizer. That's it. Eggs are in the soil. They embryonated. They waiting to get on the food. You can get them. So, bowel obstruction. Imagine having that many worms. There were patients who had 2 pounds of worms removed. Well, it's not worms that are removed. It's a chunk of intestine with the worms. So you can kill them all using mebendazole, but there's no chance your intestine will be able to pass 2 pounds of worms, right? They can actually crawl into the bile ducts and damage the liver. They can bile obstruction, a lot of conditions, and it disproportionately affects kids. In kids, it causes, since they can't properly digest food, malnutrition, kwashiorkor. It can kill kids. They can die of malnourishment. Okay? So, how to prevent it? Give people normal fertilizer. and build running toilets. Or at least deep, like, I'm blanking on the term, outhouses. Okay? It has to be, the eggs have to be buried very deep so they can't get to the surface. 6 feet is the minimum. Does that make sense? It's all about capillary forces. Okay? Treatable. One of my favorite cases of treating it, there was a family of doctors who volunteered in South America, came back to States. Before leaving South America, gave their 1-year-old kid, or 1.5, who was hanging out with other kids, a pill of albendazole. 2 weeks later, they get a call from the daycare. They are in absolute panic mode, saying that their son, they opened the diaper and there was like a 6-inch worm in the diaper, and they're like freaking out, want to like shut down the entire daycare, and they had to explain that, you know, it's dead. It's just, he was infected and the drug worked. Okay? It did. Yeah. One interesting and pretty gross feature of that worm is that they really like normal human temperature, and if the host becomes really, really hot, like fever, they try to leave. But since they're swimmers, they go in against the flow, so they get through the intestines into the stomach, through the esophagus, and they will try to crawl out of the throat. And there were cases, it's real, you can look up, there are images of kids with worms climbing out. We underappreciate that. These diseases may not kill people, but they significantly reduce the quality of life. It's a huge economic disadvantage. We're talking about literally hundreds of millions of cases of soil helminths all over the world. And if you wonder, some of them are in the United States. Hook and whipworms, not common, but are present, and I dare you to guess the geographical region where you can find cases of hook and whipworms in the United States. Huh? Dude. Yes. Remember, it has to be poor and it has to be warm. Mississippi and Alabama. Okay? Honestly, I'm surprised not Georgia, because Georgia is Alabama with Atlanta in the middle. I've been there. I know what I'm talking about. I lived in Louisiana. So, Las Strongyloides stercoralis, not in the US, pretty cool worm. Why I chose it? It is the only human helminth that has a significant stage of living independently of us. So let's take a look at the infection cycle. So there are larvae in the soil that penetrate human skin. It doesn't have to be damaged. When they get under the skin, they cause cutaneous larva migrans. It's sometimes called serpiginous rash, meaning that they bend. So all those traces that you see are larvae. And they do crawl. They crawl slowly, about 1 centimeter an hour. So the appearance will change. Eventually, they get into the bloodstream and reach intestines, where they develop into adult females. Females produce eggs. Eggs hatch in the larvae, and then you excrete these larvae in the stool. They develop in free-living worms. This is the cool part. These free-living worms mate, produce eggs. They develop into larvae. Larvae infect humans. So, technically, for Ascariasis and for Strongyloides, humans are both definitive and intermediate hosts. Okay? But Strongyloides, to my knowledge, is the only worm that has this free-living stage. How can it be relevant for you? Strongyloidiasis is very common in South America. Now, I don't know what's going to happen in our country in terms of immigration, but a lot of people who originally are from South America have strongyloiditis. The symptoms pretty much like you have diarrhea, then you have constipation. Then you have 2 weeks of diarrhea, 2 weeks of constipation. Not great. But if you become, for some reason, immunocompromised, for instance, you go through some immunosuppressive treatment, the number of larvae that are generated in your gut can become so large, so vast, that they will start infecting organs systemically. Systemic strongyloidiasis is the life-threatening condition. And there are folks, like there are cases of people developing it while in the States because they're old and they have some disease and they're being treated and suddenly it flares up. Does that make sense? And actually, like if you are hiking through the jungle somewhere in South America, wear pants. Because if your skin gets in contact with soil, that's what you can get. Okay?